good people. How are you all going? I hope you're well. I thought I'd take a moment to record the lectures for HSP216 for week 4. This week's lecture, the first one, focuses on talking about what police roles are, what their functions are, their powers and their duties. And the second lecture is going to talk about the problem of bias, and only particularly with police powers. We could probably talk about bias in all the other areas as well, but I'd need like a week to do that. So we'll just stick to powers for that one. But I'll walk you through an example to get you thinking about those issues. But this lecture is just going to step you through getting to know the differences between these ideas of roles, functions, powers, and duties before we move into other stuff. We're also going to talk about the images of policing and how they influence different social and cultural factors. Now, we all have particular ideas about police that come to mind when we think about police officers, right? For instance, this particular cartoon is a police officer giving a person a traffic fine for saying that he's sexy. He's not. But whether or not the ideas we have in our head actually meet the expectations in reality is an ongoing source of debate. We often think about police and we think about them in terms of what we see in the media, right? Running around after crooks, all of that sort of stuff, when ironically the majority of police work is done in a station sitting at a computer typing up a lot of reports. So it's not exactly riveting stuff. Nonetheless, it's still a very complex, difficult job. It's a multifaceted activity in an increasingly complex and fragmented world. And I think Morbihan writes sum it up very well in that respect. They do talk about how variety is the spice of police work. You get up every day, you do something different, it's never the same, all of that sort of stuff. But then there's other people that say, well, most of our jobs are family violence and that's all we do, all of that sort of thing too. So it's interesting depending on who you talk to. They're more or less shaped in terms of a range of different needs. So it's local needs, national needs, the needs of the organisations, the expectations of the community. All of these things shape what police do. And they do act as a multifunctional 24-hour emergency service that perform a myriad of different tasks. Maintenance and dissemination of info, protection of life and property, of course, maintaining public order, and ensuring what they call social happiness, which is absolutely correct. If your happiness is attached to a cat that's stuck up a tree, then they're probably going to help with that. If your happiness is attached to not living with an abusive partner, they're probably going to try and sift with that too. So that is really a huge role. And how society is policed often also depends on who is policed and whether or not those people are vulnerable and marginalised. So the usual images we get from police, most likely from the media, as I mentioned before, are things like attending crimes, attending scenes of accidents, incidents and deaths, law enforcement, so issuing fines and following through with arrests and warrants, rescues at accidents and natural disasters, investigations of nuisance and disorder reports, looking at forensic work, in addition to intelligence work, which is focused on, the work that detectives do, for instance. There's specific targeting of criminals, and this also happens through ideas about intelligence too, where they track particular people and certain types of crime in different areas. Then we've got things like patrols. Foot patrols, car patrols. About 75% of police work internationally happens through patrol. But ironically enough, it's also one of the most ineffective for controlling crime. It's more about symbolic affirmation of authority over territory and making sure the public know that they're doing something. There's intervention forces. So for instance, the police were called in to be part of the Northern Territory intervention. And of course, there's regulation exercises. They might regulate the Coalition of Australian Governments meeting, for instance. in addition to exercising and commanding authority, which they definitely need to do at times when, especially when they're dealing with critical incidents. The not so usual images of police are most definitely the softer sides of police work. So I've interviewed lots of police officers who would definitely say they're not social workers, yet a lot of the work that they do comes into contact with people who are or should be in contact with social workers. They are a social service and they provide help and assistance. They organise protests and events in conjunction with different community groups, and they have discretion for deciding whether or not to enforce the law. Of course, this is definitely not the usual image we have of police. They do have the capacity to make a decision about whether or not to go ahead with a fine or press charges around a particular incident. One of the most dominant characteristics of law enforcement, according to Waddington, is the non-enforcement of the law. It's a powerful, powerful tool, and especially one that if it's not used, it can impact people's lives in the long term quite badly. They also decide whether or not something is actually a crime, and there's this whole dark figure of crime that we know nothing about, and what we call no criming, which is where the police have a look and investigate something and decide that there's no crime. They also regulate general civility. So, for instance, they might be called to go down to a nightclub or attend the Boxing Day sales when things get a bit rowdy. And of course, most importantly, and this is a beautiful quote that summarises it very well, it's the something that ought not to be happening and about which someone had better do something now, which most commonly falls to police officers, because they are, most of the time, first responders, depending on which jurisdiction you're in. They're very much not thinking about themselves as social workers, and a lot of people wouldn't think about them either as social workers. For instance, this liaison officer says in one of my own projects, the community doesn't want to meet every month to say what? We're police, we're not social workers, we're not offering a solution. So all of these ideas are ideas that we have about police officers and what they do and their function. There's also a whole range of different specialist units, like firearms, traffic, mounted police, dog squads, bomb squads, child protection, special victims and sexual assault units, family violence, public order, school and drugs liaison, and partnership coordination units that sometimes involve multiple officers in those partnerships. So the core policing functions are, then, clearly not getting a cat out of a tree. The core policing functions are a broad range of tasks, including public reassurance, crime reduction, crime investigation, emergency service, peacekeeping, order maintenance, and state security. So all of these things are what police are involved in. But defining these and, putting boundaries around them, it's a tough gig. It's very much further complicated by this notion. Are police a force or are they a service? And who you talk to will definitely depend on what they tell you. I've spoken to heaps of officers who said that they're definitely a service. And I've heard many officers say, we don't serve people, we enforce the law. And it's for them all about the authoritative wielding of power. So that is a constant source of debate because the way the community sees the police is also very much influenced by that. And the community demand for particular types of roles and functions to be part of what police do are getting stronger and more vocal by the day. So they might not want to be doing stuff that's community policing, like playing midnight basketball with a bunch of young people who are at risk of being involved in crime, right? But the community might want that, so the community pressure wins out, and here the police are at 8 o'clock on Thursday night playing basketball. Those types of things have a really big influence on what police roles look like. Waddington says it really well. He says, to the extent that police exercise authority over citizens, then policing is hesitant and cautious because citizens have rights. But where police impose alien authority on a rebellious subject population, then coercive power is exercised with little restraint. And we have a lot of evidence in research now that suggests this is the case. So, Finlay has a great little outline of 13 factors which influence police functions. The first of these is traditions and conventions of policing. So, is it focused on public order? Is it focused on securing capital? Interestingly enough, it's the state based officers that are focused on public order, and it's often the private officers that are focused on securing capital, which is, of course, security. There's political expedience. Governments are very much reliant on police as a general public service, and they can call them to order anytime they want. So if they've got some VIP visiting, they need to have security detail, and the security detail will often be police officers. There's also the perception that people have of police. The organisations and the individual police officers are impacted by policing perceptions and what the public actually think about them. So if they're not thinking that the police is particularly great in their local community, then they're probably not going to go to them. And they're not going to see them as someone that they want to go and do a community crime prevention program with, right? It just makes perfect sense. And there's also a lot of different community expectations. While, Dorothy, 85, down the road, sees a bunch of young people on the corner, feels threatened, calls the police, expects them to come over and tell the kids to go away. Whereas, David, who's 42, works in an office, is certainly not thinking that that is a role for police. So those community expectations definitely influence how that happens. Media representation is massive, and there are books that are written about this a lot now, and the way that police organisations manage their image in the media, but most importantly, the way that they have come now to work with the media so that it helps to give a specific type of message to the public in times of critical incidents and all of that sort of stuff. The nature of the community being policed is absolutely important too. Again, if there's a lot of people in the local community that are being harassed by police on a daily basis, then they're probably not going to go and want to hang out with the police officers. Then they're probably not going to go and want to hang out with police officers at a nighttime barbecue to get to know them, especially if those police officers are well known for being violent. There's also internal bureaucratic constraints. Resourcing and government funding are massive. For instance, in some parts of the US, you might call the police, but they don't turn up for 4 days simply because they don't have enough police officers. And that's not their fault. It's not that they're not hiring. It's that they don't have enough money to actually get those bums on seats to do the work. There's also organisational policy, and of course this differs by rank, experience and specialisation, and there are thousands of policies across a single police organisation, and depending on which area you're in, you need to know about them as an officer. It's pretty opaque, and there's so much stuff that they need to understand and get their heads around. More importantly, a lot of that policy is actually not made available freely to the public, which is even more confounding. Nonetheless, it's important. So the discretion and structures of responsibility will have a big difference as well. If there is a wide use of police discretion, because this particular commissioner has decided that that's what needs to happen, it's about building relationships, not enforcing the law, then that's going to have a very serious impact on what a police role looks like and what their functions are. There's individual and collective determinations of law as well, decisions that are handed down in the courts which shape the way that policing can be done. So for instance, there's a number of police organisations that have been targeted for campaigns around quotas and keeping numbers of fines and arrests and all of that, stop and frisks, and they have actually had to put legislation in place to discourage the use of quotas in these police organisations, which I think is really quite bizarre. But nonetheless, that is something that would definitely influence police function. There's professional standards and job satisfaction as well, and this notion of best practice, and of course outcomes of different types of complaint procedures, in addition to whether or not an officer is really jaded with an organisation, will really have an impact on how the police unit functions, and sometimes just teams within those units. Pressures from other agencies influence this too. There's police as gatekeepers and how they prioritise some things over others. So some criminal justice organisations like Child Protection might want to look at child abuse and do that on a regular basis. Whereas police are like, that's 1% of our job. 75% of our job is family violence. So we need to put our resources over here. So it's those tensions between those points which can really lead to different outcomes about what the police function looks like. And of course, we've got occupational solidarity or police culture. So it's the binding ties between police officers that will determine how police function in everyday life, and particularly in public spaces. So that's a lot of things that are influencing police function. But there are other things as well. There's pluralisation. Again, that idea of the privatisation of security work. So we've got security officials that are doing that work and they're working in conjunction with police. There's transnational pressures and the idea that, you just need to hand over that data about that particular incident. That's never been needed before now. There's developments in media and information technologies like this particular cartoon where the people of colour are saying, don't shoot to the police officer, and the police officer's holding a gun and saying, don't shoot to the person holding the camera behind them. So media does make police more accountable, but it also makes them more visible and things like that too. And that will change their function and their role. And finally, there's theorisation around risk societies. The more we get to know about risks in the community, the more likely we are to have policies and bring it into police awareness. But more importantly, the more that feeds anxieties that police have and that communities have around how those functions work. Factors are also impacted by different images of police, and this can happen through personal experience, particularly negative experience. It can come from word of mouth. Even if someone's never had an experience with police that's bad, they can have heard about 5 of them and not want a bar of any police officers whatsoever. There's news and media which influence that greatly too, and different forms of entertainment that kind of show us what policing is like, but not in reality. Sometimes there's a little bit closer to stuff in policing, reality TV shows, but not the greatest stuff in the world. But all of these forms of information, again, can be highly dubious. But it does show us the visibility of police work and the ways that it can be shaped with those different things. So when we think about police work, then we think about the role, we think about the duties, and we think about the powers most often. So the role is what police have to do because it's generic, prescribed, and expected, and it's often detailed in legislation or alternatively in a police manual that's drawn from legislation. The duties. What must police do because it's requested by the hierarchy, the job, or the current incident? Powers, what tools the law allows them to use in everyday policing work. And I'm going to talk very quickly about each of these now in turn. So the police role, it's about law enforcement and crime prevention. It's about reassurance, peacekeeping, order maintenance, and other forms of protection of people. Police officers walking into a family violence situation, helping the woman to get her stuff, and ensuring the kids are protected from the person that's perpetrating the violence. There's also liaison officers and other extended police family like volunteers. There's detectives, supervisors, custody officers, police educators that work at the academy that I work at. There's policy officers, which can actually be police officers. And of course, there's spokespersons that they have for different policies, depending on what it is. So all of these different types of things about these roles have different places. You can find a lot about the roles in different types of, police service acts, for instance, like the one they've got in Tassie. In the normal police brief, in the public expectations and the way that they shape it. And of course, the new modern public expectations that we have around connecting with communities, terrorism, and national security, which 15, 20 years ago really weren't on the radar at all. And of course, we've got policies which define it too, in addition to just responding, quite frankly, to really new trends that emerge sometimes literally overnight. Duties are a little bit different. This is the things that officers do. Investigative interviewing, for instance, writing statements, looking at different schedules, how you need to, watch warrants and all of that sort of stuff, door knocks, paperwork, data entry, writing reports. All of these things are typical police duties. And this is, of course, informed by, again, internal policies, law enforcement processes, including transnational situations. It's driven by necessities as well. So there's a problem here. We need an outcome there, so we'll do something about it. It's driven by job descriptions and, of course, the position that they hold in the hierarchy. And then we have powers, which we will talk about a little bit more in the second lecture this week. That's investigation of offences, the fact that they can search and seize property, arrest, questioning, prosecution of summary offences, controlled operations, the discretion when they make decisions not to act, random breath tests, move-alongs. All of these things are different types of police powers. But it's very important to understand that these are normally powers which are unlawful. There is no way as a member of the public that I could go and kidnap somebody. But effectively, police do this every time they arrest someone. They put them in handcuffs, they take them down to the station, and they process them, and that is technically a form of kidnap. So all of these things are very important for them to have in order to be able to do their roles. But, of course, there's balancing that out with human rights, which is very important. And due process versus crime control is one of the longest standing debates that will never go away, I can assure you. So how do we follow due process and make sure that things are being done in the right way and that human rights are protected versus crime control and cracking down on such and such that's going on down at the local 7-Eleven? We've got laws that stipulate the powers, of course. We've got the hierarchy that passes powers down. Sometimes within hours, and they just need to go and action it immediately. Some of them have evolved through time, and they still do evolve right now. And some powers are very much more monitored than others, particularly the police abuse of different powers. Some of them are allowed a bit of leeway, but not much usually. And there is a lot of discussion and debate about force, as you probably well know. Using discretion in these types of powers is very powerful stuff, but it is limited in law in terms of how much discretion they have, but not usually in action. So they can, at the end of the day, stand there and decide not to prosecute or to actually prosecute, depending on the circumstance. Powers are always different in jurisdictions. So, for instance, they have pat-down powers in Queensland when they're searching a young person, whereas in other jurisdictions they don't have that because they believe that's a breach of their human rights. Most importantly, these powers are subject to a lot of change, and it can be pretty challenging to get our heads around that on a regular basis. There are specific types of models of police powers, and these are quite what we've just talked about a little bit too. The crime control model, which is about prioritising the conviction of the guilty, risking sometimes the conviction of innocent people, and perhaps the infringement of civil liberties in order to achieve that. Then there's the due process model, which is the kind of the opposite end of the spectrum to this, I suppose. It prioritises civil liberties in order to secure maximal acquittal of the innocent, but it risks acquittal of many guilty people in that process too. Now, they are really at polar opposite ends, and it's the freedom model that's probably being taken up a little bit more recently. They are very much focused on convicting the guilty rather than the innocent, and protecting the innocent from wrongful conviction, which we know, looking at projects like the Innocence Project, that happens quite a lot. We need to ensure that human rights are safeguarded against arbitrary or oppressive treatment, which is something that does happen often. That they maintain order, that they secure public confidence in and cooperation with policing and prosecution is absolutely imperative. Even if that does mean a guilty verdict and a sentence, they can still have a really good experience with police if the police are respectful. And then, of course, we've got things like managing to somehow achieve all of this without disproportionate costs to the organisation, harm to the officers, or harm to other public services and the public. So the freedom model is very complex, and you can see why this is the one that probably most influences police powers right now, because there are so many things which inform the way that they're unfolding. So I hope this gives you a little bit more information about this very huge area. It tells you about legitimacy and illegitimacy of different forms of coercion, watching those around them and how they abstain from intervention, making sure that they're taking charge in certain situations and they're able to intervene, and how this is done in a way that supports good relationships with civilians and the state. Ultimately, it is about the exercise of authority of the state over the civil population, and that is a very huge responsibility to hold on one's shoulders. Most importantly, a fantastic paper that was written by one of my colleagues from QUT, Nigel Stubbs, notes that the effectiveness of policing activities relies to a large extent on the degree to which the public accepts and acquiesces to police authority and believes in the legitimacy of their role. So none of these things, according to Stubbs and a lot of other research now, are achievable if we don't have, if the police don't have the support of the public in the first instance. I'm going to shut up now. I hope that was useful and you got something out of it, and I will talk to you all soon. See ya!